Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we have part 2 of the story with the headline, Underground Railroad Reminiscences. This article was written by H.E. Nottingham. In the minutes of the Calliopean Literary Society for May 14, 1836, is an account of a trial in which Mr. Lewis Granger was expelled from the organization for taking part in a mob which attempted to break up an abolitionist meeting at the Lancaster Schoolhouse, south of town. Several attempts were made by him to get reinstated, which he finally accomplished many years after he left school. Probably the most disgraceful mob violence in Granville occurred when the Anti-Slavery Convention met here in 1836. Again, the authorities refused the hospitality of the village, and again Mr. Ashley Bancroft offered his large barn for their meeting. A very good recital of this may be found in Bushnell's History of Granville. There was a large crowd from all the neighboring country and villages, and some even from as far away as Mount Vernon, gathered to break up the convention. They lacked a good leader, however, and nothing was done until the people from the convention marched into town. Then a lively battle ensued, and many a person carried the marks of this bloody encounter for several days. In a letter of March 24, 1904, to the Times, by Mr. F. J. Miller, who was a student here at the time, says that there were 2 days of the convention, and it was during the intervening night that the great mob was collected. He says also that the mob did not go out to break up the convention because they had become too intoxicated. Someone had rolled a barrel of whiskey into the street and invited them to help themselves, which they did. An interesting account of these early struggles may be found in History of Licking County, Ohio, compiled by W. W. Hill, Jr. The Advocate for April 30, 1836, gives a statement of the riots caused in Granville by the abolition meetings, and says that in Wednesday night's meeting preceding the riot, over $4,000 were contributed by the abolitionists to support a press to be established at Cincinnati and to defray the expense of printing abolition tracts. A good article of this Granville riot may be found in Mrs. E. Sinnett's scrapbook, from which the writer is freely drawn. This book contains many interesting clippings concerning Granville history. There is one especially good concerning Samuel White, who was such an enthusiastic advocate of the anti-slavery movement in its early days. One of the most notable things that he did for the cause was in connection with the fugitive John, who had been overtaken by his master in Newark. Sam White was practicing law at that time, 1841, in Newark. He served as attorney for the unfortunate black man and had once secured a change of venue, so the case was brought before Judge Samuel Bancroft at Granville. The trial was held in what is now Old Welsh Church. There were assembled the owner, his attorneys, pro-slavery men, anti-slavery men, and others out to hear this trial, but the abolitionists managed to fill up the space between the prisoner and the door. On account of some technicality in regard to the arrest, the fugitive was set free. As soon as the verdict was announced, Sam White yelled, "Knock off those shackles, no chains here." The owner and his sympathizers attempted to rush the slave, but were hurled back, and again White's voice rang out, "Stand back, no interference here, not on your lives, make way for God and liberty." The iron shackles had been tampered with, and they dropped from the man's ankles, and he was literally lifted along over the heads and shoulders of that throng of pesky abolitionists, like a roll of cloth, and landed at the door, where stood 2 of the swiftest horses that could be found, both saddled, and a burly man with a pistol in hand and one saddle. The man was tossed into the other saddle, an abolitionist being in each stirrup to steer his feet into them, the rein thrust into one hand, a loaded pistol into the other hand, with the injunction to shoot if he had to, but ride like hell anyhow. They went up Old Broadway like a flash. Before the bereft Southerner could draw a good breath, the riders had disappeared over the hill on the west side of historic Granville and were hurling themselves on through Old Loudon Street, headed for Canada, God, and liberty. A good supply of relays had been provided for, so the master had a very poor chance of overtaking his former slave. This account is taken largely from material furnished by Theophilus Little of Kansas City, Kansas. He contributed other valuable accounts, which may be seen in the paper appended to this article. Bushnell's History of Granville, pages 307 to 308, give a full account of this trial. The writer has been unable to find many parties south of Granville who brought fugitives here. Mrs. Mary Jones, the wife of E. L. Jones and the daughter of Samuel Vance, who lived in Union Township, tells about her father bringing fugitives from their place to Granville. On the farm where the college formerly stood, Runaways were sometimes kept, and at Mr. Rose's place on the top of the hill, about a mile south of Granville on the Lancaster Road, is alleged to have been an Underground Railroad station. Mr. Samuel Vance lived about 1.5 miles east of Union Station. He was for a long time the only one in the township who voted the abolitionist ticket. He used to keep the fugitives in his attic until he had a chance to bring them to Captain Rose's place or to Edwin Wright's, the tanner. Mrs. Jones recalled seeing her father stow away 2 big black fellows beneath a load of oats, which was headed for Granville. One day, 2 finely dressed gentlemen came to Mr. Vance's place and looked his place over thoroughly, especially the buildings. They claimed that they were looking for a good place to buy, but later Mr. Vance learned that these men were merely looking for their lost slaves. In Granville, there were several places where the black traveler could always find a welcome reception. Just south of town on the Lancaster Road, and what is now known as the Wilson Farm, Justin Hillier kept a busy station. William Whitney, who lived probably where Dr. Baldwin lives now, also befriended the runaways. It is claimed that he had several fugitives for a day or two in a new cistern which he was making. It is claimed that the place where President Talbot formerly lived, now occupied by Mrs. Borden, was an Underground Railroad station. In those days, Mrs. Susan Allen and her son William were living there. Later, the house was remodeled by Manuel Giddings. An underground passage from the cellar to a well nearby has been found. There was also a false ceiling in one room. Between this and the upstairs floor, the fugitives were concealed. Then there was a false partition with a secret stairway to the cellar. Mr. Ralph Parsons kept a station on the southeast corner of Broadway and Mulberry Streets, where Burn Case now lives. They concealed the slaves in an unfinished part of the house and in the shed back of the house. Mrs. George Parsons told of 2 fugitives who made Granville their home. The man was called Cudjoe, and his wife Caroline. Their little cabin was situated on the northeast corner of Plum and Elm Streets. Mrs. Cudjoe survived her husband several years. Edwin Wright's home was on the Newark Road just outside of the town, on the site now occupied by the first house on the right-hand side of the road, beyond the little creek just east of the village. Mrs. Sinnott recalls seeing fugitives hidden in the attic at her father's place, and also how they took them away in covered rigs. Mr. Wright had a tannery, and so it was convenient for the abolitionists south of town to bring fugitives to him. Then kindred spirits from the north would take them on northward when they returned from the tannery. Mr. Vance, referred to above, took slaves there. Mr. John O. Jones, father of E.L. Jones, who lived north of town, used to get fugitives from Edwin Wright's and give them a boost on their journey. Uncle Joe Little was probably the most active agent along the line. His Underground Railroad station was on what is now known as the J.S. Jones Farm. Then all the buildings were near the road. He was, as Mr. Little states, the station agent and proprietor thereof, owned all the rolling stock and motive power, and a train was always ready to pull out whenever there were passengers to transport along the line. He owned a large, powerful, and swift cream horse with black mane and tail. This noble beast was called Old Mike, and it was his duty to always head the train. The Little farm had numerous buildings, barns, sheds, granaries, woodhouses, etc., affording many hiding places for the fleeing slaves. Sometimes he would be put in the woodhouse with a pile of wood stacked around him, or in the loft thereof with piles of old boxes and barrels heaped around him, or in the hay with a ton or 2 of hay above him, and often in the granary, which had bins and could be kept locked day and night without attracting attention, as it was customary to keep the granary locked. Sometimes it was necessary to detain the black man for a week or more, because the master's scouts or spies were close upon his trail. To be continued. Check back soon for the next installment of this incredible story. This story came from the great state of Ohio, being reported in the Granville Times of January 11th, 1912. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.